At the end of August, Americans were horrified by an attack on a Catholic school in Minneapolis. The perpetrator was one Robert Westman, who at that point had changed his name to Robin Westman. The perpetrator was a transsexual, and this has been a cause for a great deal of comment online, with people wondering to what extent transgender treatments of various kinds involving hormones or perhaps psychological disturbances going back to an identity crisis in childhood or in the teenage years, whether all of this might have been a factor in leading Robert Westman, who became Robin Westman, to kill 2 students at a Catholic school and injure another 18. It's a horrible incident, and it should be a cause for a national conversation on the dangers that are posed by some of these treatments. This is, of course, not the first time that there has been a mass killing that's been perpetrated by someone who had a transgender identity. Now, to say that this is something that needs to be talked about is not to say that we need to jump to conclusions. It doesn't mean that we should automatically assume that there's anything necessarily that's going to drive people who are transgender identifying into behaving violently. On the contrary, most of the evidence, the fact that there are many more people who identify as transgender than who commit acts of violent murder or other crimes, that's a pretty good indication that this, in fact, is a marginal issue even among the transgender community. Nevertheless, if you look at the statistics, if you look at the percentage, the proportion of recent spree killers or mass killers who have been transgender as opposed to those who have been not transgender, you will find that there is a disproportion there. It's a cause for concern, and it's worth wondering, in the first place, whether in some cases people who are profoundly disturbed and whose identity crises may in fact be part of a parcel of other problems which could lead them to violent behavior, whether some of these profoundly disturbed individuals are being overlooked or being treated in a sort of dismissive fashion rather than having their problems recognized and addressed because their problems have been politicized, because a political identity, namely the transgender identity, has been taken up as the key thing that is their identity, as opposed to the fact that they are profoundly troubled. So in other words, if you have 2 things going on at the same time, if you don't in fact have the transgender identity being a cause of the violence, nevertheless, because there is a tendency for a liberal community to overlook other problems that may be associated with people who are involved in the transgender identity, there may be a tendency for other problems, those that can lead to extremely serious violent behavior, also being overlooked. Now, all of that is just to say that these are questions that are legitimate. They are something that has to be asked by the public. They are not to be dismissed simply because they are politically incorrect, simply because the conversations are uncomfortable. And certainly when we look at an atrocity like was committed in Minneapolis, this is something that the public has every right to have strong opinions about and to get involved in. It doesn't mean that, again, it's appropriate to jump to conclusions without doing the research first, without actually trying to discuss this and understand it more profoundly. But it certainly is something that needs to be taken seriously. Hi, I'm Dan McCarthy, the editor of Modern Age, a conservative review. You can find Modern Age online every weekday at modernagejournal.com. You'll find my podcast there. We'll also see a variety of terrific articles going behind the headlines, looking at the philosophical substance of conservatism. We have new articles written today by some of the best minds on the American right. We also, however, have archives going back decades, all the way to 1957, when Modern Age was founded as a print journal. You'll find a rich mixture of both the most classic conservative think pieces of the decades, along with the most cutting-edge ideas on the right in the 21st century. Now, I don't necessarily want to talk all that much about transgenderism itself here, because that's a conversation that's been going on in America for several years now. It's something that there are entire, podcasts, books, whole programs dedicated to. Instead, I want to draw attention to something else, something on the periphery. So shortly before news of this horrible atrocity broke, there were other stories going around, especially in Florida, about recent cases involving the politics of transgenderism. In particular, there was a case in a Florida school back in April where a school teacher was fired for supposedly using a student's preferred name. Now, I learned about this on Facebook because a libertarian professor, who is a Facebook friend of mine, who actually teaches in a red state, not in Florida, noticed this story, posted a little meme about it and said, oh, this is such an outrage. Why should a Florida school district fire a teacher simply for using a student's preferred name? Well, I saw this meme and I thought, this obviously doesn't make sense. Clearly there's more to this story than my friend the professor was letting on. And of course, all it took was a quick Google and you can find out the details. Namely, that it was, of course, not just a nickname being used or a middle name or a pet name. This was basically a teacher regendering a student, basically a teacher changing the sex of a student, at least at the nominal level, at least at the level of the student's name. This was using a name that was sex inappropriate, that was gender inappropriate. Now, that's against the law in Florida. Florida has a law which says that teachers cannot simply change a minor's name and along with it their gender on their own spontaneous desire. Instead, if a teacher is going to call a student by a new name, especially a gender inappropriate name, they have to get explicit parental permission for this. The teacher in the case in Florida did not do that, and so her contract was not renewed. She faces various penalties. She has to take a college ethics course, for example, to teach her why what she did was wrong, why it was wrong to use this name. And she has to pay a fine, and she faces various other possible penalties as well. Although right now it seems as if her teaching license will be allowed to remain valid. Now, what was striking to me about this case is not, again, the transgenderism at the center of it. Individuals have a great deal of variety. It's not shocking that there happen to be people who have sexual confusion or sexual identity confusion, gender confusion. You expect on the margins to find some people who don't fit into the normal categories of society, people who, in some cases deliberately, in other cases perhaps feeling an overwhelming obsession or urge towards it, are going to wind up adopting identities that are at variance with society's expectations. That's not so unusual when it comes to individuals. What is very unusual, what is much stranger even than transgenderism itself, is the reaction of our society to this phenomenon. The fact that you have many progressives, many liberals, and unfortunately even some libertarians, like my academic friend who started this meme on Facebook, who take the abnormal, who take the deviant case and actually make that an argument against having norms at all. And in fact, they use it not only to change the norms of sex and gender, but also now to change the norms of authority within schools, ultimately usurping the place of parents, sidelining parents, and instead giving teachers themselves, free from any kind of legal supervision and free from the control of parents, giving teachers themselves the spontaneous authority to decide whether or not a student's claim to be transgender or to have a new sex is legitimate or not. Now, keep in mind, there is a reason why students are considered minors, why persons under the age of 18 have not attained the age of legal majority. This means that they are not capable of making the most profound decisions about their own lives for themselves. It means they always have to be under the responsibility of an adult. In the case of schools, that means up to a point they are under the responsibility of teachers. Teachers themselves, of course, are answerable to school systems, and ultimately those school systems are answerable to state law. In the case of this Florida incident, you had a teacher who decided consciously to defy state law, as well as to defy the school and to defy the parents. And it's the flagrant violation of parental authority that really needs to be highlighted here, because it's shocking that there should be a libertarian teaching in higher education, admittedly in a different state, who nevertheless would say, you know what, public school employees, an employee of the state, an employee of the government, has greater authority over a child's sex and identity than a parent does, and that a parent's permission is not required for a teacher simply to make this change. Now, of course, the argument that the other side makes is that this is not being imposed by a teacher. This is something that a student has initiated. But keep in mind, students are minors. If they're below the age of 18, they do not, in fact, have the legal or the moral or the sort of personal mental capacity to make some of these decisions for themselves, and to make them without having a parent's consultation, and to make them in such a way that then a teacher feels as if they can take this opportunity and use it to so-called, affirm is the word that the left uses. It's frankly a way of changing the student's identity. And you can see that there is tremendous potential for abuse here, tremendous potential for grooming. that a teacher who has a design on corrupting a student's morality or damaging a student's identity might encourage a student who is perhaps she's a girl who's a tomboy, perhaps perhaps you have a boy student who is not interested in sports or other traditional masculine activities. You could have a teacher try to plant the seeds of changing a sex, changing an identity, rather than simply being a student, a kid who has, somewhat gender atypical, but not really pathological, deviations from the norms of either being male or female. Giving teachers, giving any kind of state employee that sort of power is a tremendous usurpation of parental authority. Clearly, parents know their children better than anyone, and for the state to step in under any circumstances would be quite shocking. To say, however, that it's not just the state that's stepping in, it's rather any individual teacher without regard for the law of the state, but any individual teacher who happens to have your student, your son or daughter, in her classroom is able to, encourage these kinds of changes of identity, including changes of sex. That, it seems to me, is an extremely radical position for anyone to have. And it certainly is something that I would think a libertarian, who would normally be quite critical of any kind of government schooling and the power of government employees like teachers, it's a shocking thing, especially for a libertarian like that, to adopt. And yet, this ideology of transgenderism, and this, not just the ideology of transgenderism, but the ideology of liberalism that surrounds the ideology of transgenderism, is so comprehensive that once someone buys into it partly, it winds up being something that becomes overwhelming and really going beyond the pale, going beyond even reasonable limits to, in fact, sort of changing their whole view, not just of sex and sexuality, but even their view of the role of government and even the role of parental rights. Now, think about that. A progressive, a liberal, would be absolutely aghast if a state government employee, if a teacher, were trying to change a student's religion, or if a student expressed interest in converting to a religion, and the teacher then encouraged that, or affirmed it, or said, okay, this is now your new religion. That would be seen as a shocking violation of the separation of schools and religion, the separation of church and state at the school level, because public schooling is mandatory, or at least is something that schooling is mandatory, and public schooling, of course, is the overwhelming channel for most students in America to be educated. This is a tremendous power over people's most innermost thoughts and sense of being, their most deep values and commitments. And if you allow teachers and other government employees to wield this kind of power, even if they claim, and who can verify this, right? But even if they claim that this is initiated by a student, the dangers obviously are very great, and you have basically people who are not capable of taking responsibility for themselves because they are minors being crafted and transformed and, again, even groomed by their teachers. So that's a very shocking thing. But again, what is remarkable here is that we've gone this far without recognizing just how problematic all of this is. Now, luckily, the state of Florida does have very good laws which are preventing this. And so you had a teacher whose contract was not renewed because of what she did. There was a very good statement from the superintendent saying that this was an unconscionable violation of parental rights. And it's important that Florida has a law to this effect, and it's a law basically which all 50 states should have, and which, Washington, D.C. is not a state, but the federal district should also have a law that safeguards parental rights, safeguards the integrity of students in their sexual identity and in their sex, and prevents teachers from, freelancing and taking it upon themselves to wield this tremendous power over their students and their students' identity. Now, there is obviously a tendency, everyone wants to be compassionate here, and liberals in particular don't want to be judgmental. Nevertheless, when you put these things together, when you put together the fact that any number of mental illnesses might be excused or overlooked or minimized because a political case is made about someone's gender confusion or their desire to change their gender. Because of that, when you put that together with the propensity of teachers and other authority figures, either simply to go along with something that a student has already decided upon, or to try to impose that on a student, or to try to gradually, as a kind of Pied Piper, lead the student along. That leads to all kinds of risks for society. It also leads, of course, to profound difficulties for students and for young people. Now, in the case of the Minneapolis shooter, we're still finding out about exactly what the family situation there was. I think there's been a little bit too much of a tendency to leap to conclusions about the role of either the mother or the father in this person's identity problems. If you look at the journals of the killer, they are written in a Cyrillic print, but they are in English. So in other words, you have the Cyrillic alphabet being used for what are basically English entries in a journal, with the occasional Russian pronoun thrown in. But this really is not a difficult linguistic case to crack. This is simply a matter of, if you can read Cyrillic, then you're able to decrypt this and see that it in fact is English. The killer's journals, at least the pages I've looked at that were displayed on YouTube, are simply full of desires to kill. And while there are occasional references to the killer, for example, saying that he regretted becoming involved in transgenderism, he says he regrets getting involved in marijuana. But it also seems, from the text of these journals, that this may not be sincere, that in fact this person was not trying to get away from those subcultures, but on the contrary, this person was driven to kill in part because he says in the journals that it would be a concession of defeat and to have to renounce a transgender identity. So there's this entire mess, but the bulk of the journals are fantasies about killing, discussions of the kind of ammunition and firearms this individual wants to acquire, and the targets that this person is going to choose and then murder. So it's a terrible psychopathological document, and it's by no means overwhelmingly about gender or anything political. It's not a manifesto at all. In fact, it is the ravings of a very disturbed and diseased mind. There is a question, to what extent should the parents have detected that this person, 5 years ago, around 2020, when this individual changed his name from Robert to Robin with parental permission, or at least his mother's permission, to what extent at that point should it have been apparent that this was in fact a deeply disturbed individual who is not merely transgender, but also had perhaps even then violent tendencies. You do wonder exactly, what the long-run development of this mentality is. It's possible that, things that have happened in the last 5 years drove someone who was somewhat disturbed into an absolute depth of depravity, which has led to this mass slaying. But it's also very possible, and in fact, I think there's evidence to suggest that this was something that was accumulating for a long time. My point here is not to point a finger at the parents. And again, we don't even know the full details there. My point is rather to make a more general case that there are too many disturbed young people who are being humored by authority figures. And I don't know whether that's the case with the parents here, but it certainly is the case more generally, that you have too many young people who are deeply disturbed, who have various kinds of irregularities, who, rather than being treated as in need of intervention, are instead treated as being in need of affirmation. And that's one of the areas where I see transgender ideology as being particularly dangerous, because again, it's always about taking these disturbed individuals and saying, we are going to affirm this, we are not going to challenge it, we're not going to question it, we're not going to provide any kind of resistance to it, and we're also not going to say that maybe this is a part of a larger problem. Instead, we're going to say, this is a political choice, this is a personal sexual choice, and therefore you are now going to be affirmed in your identity, as opposed to someone whose mental health and character are going to be re-examined. Now, another aspect that needs to be taken into account in light of what happened in Minneapolis is also the violent rhetoric that has begun to be very strongly associated with the transgender movement. Now, as it happens, the lieutenant governor of Minnesota, just a few years before this, about 2 years ago, appeared in public at an event with Governor Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota, where the lieutenant governor, who's also a Democrat, was wearing a shirt that said, "Protect trans kids." Now, of course, we want to protect children of all kinds, so that's, not something that would be a shocking or provocative shirt to wear, except this didn't simply have the words "protect trans kids" on it. It had a picture of a knife that clearly was, intended as a violent warning. And in fact, you can look at a magazine published in Eugene, Oregon this summer, the local alt weekly in Eugene, Oregon, and it has a transsexual posing with a AR-15 style rifle. The tendency now to have this violent imagery associated with political transgenderism is quite pronounced, and one should not be surprised if that starts to lead to very dangerous consequences. Notice as well, by the way, that there's a certain curious thing here, because the claim always is that people who claim to be transgender are sincere about it, that this is something that is a deep inner sense of rejection of their body and their physical sex, and that they instead have somehow a knowledge of what it is to be a member of the other sex with a very different kind of body, but somehow they just know this internally, and that this is a sincere and profound commitment to being of a sex, of a gender that is not biologically one's own. And yet, it is curious that so many, especially male to female transsexuals or transgendered persons, have a notably masculine belligerence to their character, and that they are often as combative as men tend to be. Certainly, their combativeness can be characterized as distinctly unladylike behavior. In light of that, one might wonder whether this is quite as profound a sort of platonic spiritual experience as is being claimed, or whether something else is going on here, both psychologically as well as biologically. Whether, in other words, some of these individuals who claim to be of a gender other than what they were born, whether in fact they themselves believe that deep down and are really committed to playing this new role that they've adopted, or whether in fact they still have many of the characteristics, including belligerence and aggressiveness, that are actually characteristic of their birth sex rather than what they claim to be their natural, somehow metaphysical sex. All of that, of course, is a conversation that America will be having for a very long time to come. There are, as I've noted, not only progressives who take a very strong ideological, political, pro-transgender stance, but also there are an incredible number of cowardly liberals and rather unprincipled people who may even label themselves as libertarians or in some cases as conservatives, who in fact want to smuggle in something very radical under the cover of a claim, oh, this is just common sense. So I think again about my Facebook friend's reference to this really radical act of a teacher, taking it upon themselves to regender a student. But this individual on Facebook, this academic, simply presented this as just calling a student by the name they want to be called by, as if it's as simple as calling William Bill or something like that. The fact that instead of honestly addressing the core of the question there, the real controversy, that instead it is repackaged as simply a matter of using the correct name, as if this, again, is a matter of using a nickname or a shortened name or a middle name. It's an evasion, but it's an evasion which is strategic, and it's designed to kind of lull people. And, it's a rhetorical strategy where you take something that is uncontroversial, you gain assent to that uncontroversial statement. Is it okay if a teacher calls William Bill or Billy without asking their parent? Well, just about everyone would grant, sure, that's not a problematic thing. But if you grant that, then you'll see that that principle will be turned against you, and suddenly they'll be saying, well, is it okay then if we call William Barbara? Now, that obviously is a much more radical thing to do, and yet people who want to sneak in a more radical agenda under the cover of something basic will say, well, wait a minute. Just a minute ago, didn't you grant that it was perfectly fine to use a variation on a student's name? Didn't you grant that it was okay to use a different name, perhaps a middle name or a nickname? Well, if the student, instead of saying that I'm William, but I want to be called Billy, if instead that student says I'm William, but I want to be called Barbara, why not? Why isn't that just as minimal a change as going from William to Billy? It's all just a name, right? And a name is simply a surface, therefore it should be uncontroversial. Now, of course, students go through all sorts of phases. Now, some of that might be transgenderism, which would be very serious and radical. Some of it might be they might adopt a subculture. They might become punks or goths or something like that. And as part of that, they may very well adopt a new name. So, I could imagine, famously, the punk rocker John Lydon, his name became Johnny Rotten, right? So when you become a member of various kinds of subcultures, one of the signs that you are part of that subculture is to modify your name, to change your name to reflect that subculture. And I would think that most schools, in fact, and even for that matter, I would think that some of these very permissive liberals and libertarians and unfortunately unwary conservatives, I would think that even most of them would say, no, I'm not going to start, as a teacher or as a parent, calling a student, calling a minor by some name they've adopted because they want to be in a punk rock or a goth subculture or something like that. I'm not going to start calling a kid Gobstopper because he decided that's going to be his punk rock name or something like that. On the contrary, there is a need for adults to affirm the importance of authority over children, over minors. And it's curious as well that, we have very, very properly a deep concern with some of the cases that we've seen, politicians, celebrities, and others involved in, where they are preying upon minors. And so statutory rape is still a crime. And when you have adults preying upon minors, even if they're 16, 17 years old, they're almost 18, they're almost adults, but they are not adults. And therefore, they're still covered by the law that applies to minors. Usually, most people understand this, but it's curious that exceptions are made if it's going to be for a progressive cause, for a left-wing cause, when it's going to be saying, you know what, minors actually can make their own decisions about some of these other very profound questions regarding sex and sexuality, even if they're not allowed to make their own decisions regarding dating people who are older than themselves. It would seem to me that just as the same rule that says statutory rape is a crime would also say that you have to leave minors alone when it comes to their sexuality and their sex identities, that you can't have adults who have ideological programs here trying to change them from what they naturally are into something different. Conservatives need to take this very seriously. And it's, again, I want to caution that this is not about, whipping up a sudden hysteria on the right, claiming that most transgender people are going to be violent or that there is a grand conspiracy on the part of some of those folks. On the contrary, what I think is most interesting here is not the actual individual transgendered persons who are interested in these issues, but rather this wider question of permissive liberalism and why it is that adults are now not just giving up their own authority over their own children, which is bad enough, but they're in fact even attacking the authority that other parents have over their children. And they're saying that instead, we want the children who are minors, who are not able to make decisions for themselves, basically to be liberated and emancipated from parental authority. We want to also weaken the power of the state when it comes to having a uniform law for how teachers are to behave. We're going to liberate teachers from the rest of government. The teachers are still getting, of course, a public paycheck. They're still very much living off of what the taxpayers are providing them, but they're not responsible to the taxpayers. They're not responsible to the laws that the institutions responsive to the taxpayers, like the state legislature, have written. Instead, this is almost like a new aristocracy. This is a new class that is going to take the money that taxpayers give it, and then will have no responsibility to the taxpayers, to parents, and instead will simply have command over the children that taxpayers, that parents entrust to the teachers. This is insane, really. This is revolutionary. I mean, this is almost like a French Revolution in a way. This is as shocking as the Third Estate overthrowing the other two estates of the realm in revolutionary France and overthrowing the king and ultimately executing the king and the queen. This is an inversion, in fact, of not only the natural order, but also the order that is specified by the public law in the state of Florida. And again, I say that should be the public law in all 50 states. It is an inversion of all of that to say that parents are not the primary adults responsible for their children's morals and their children's character and identity and their education as a whole, but that instead, this is not even a question now for the public and for the public law and for a state legislature legislature. No, this is instead something that teachers, for some reason, are now going to have ultimate authority over and are going to be able, with the slightest, beginning from a minor who might be confused or troubled, the teachers are then going to be able to pounce upon this and use it to lead a young person in a direction that may be profoundly damaging to them, in a direction that they, much like the shooter in Minneapolis, may wind up regretting and may wind up wishing they had never gone down that path to begin with. Teachers should not have that kind of power. It's very important that parental authority be the thing that we affirm here. Not transgender authority, not transgender ideology, but parental authority is the thing that needs to be affirmed in America in 2025.